We went to California for California maneuvers, and about February the 1st or perhaps January, we left Desert Maneuvers to go by train to New York, where we would sail to go to Europe. One thing though, the train that we were on, it was a troop train, and probably you've heard of troop trains. A troop train, there's nothing on there but soldiers, military people. The windows are all closed, the drapes, everything is shuttered, so no one can see in. But on this particular trip, we took the Northern Pacific, and on the Northern Pacific route, he crossed the Grand Canyon. And this train on a very high trestle, about halfway across the Grand Canyon, when there was nothing at all in sight, they had us open up and we could look out, and we looked down at the Grand Canyon. Most spectacular sight you could ever see. Probably one of the few people who ever got to see it like that from a train during wartime, and nobody else around, and we looked down the trestle and there was the Grand Canyon. But we went on to New York. While in New York waiting for the ship that was to take us to Europe, I received a pass, I think about for 6 hours. Went into New York City, went to a theater, not a movie theater, but where they did plays and things, and there were maybe a half dozen of us together, and somebody I'm sure you have heard of, I had never heard of a bit in this world. This young guy comes out, and his name is Frank Sinatra, and he sings for us. I don't know what he sang, but he sang a song for us, and I remembered that later as he became more and more famous, that gee, I saw Frank Sinatra when he was just a kid. But then we got on board a ship, and the ship was called the Queen Mary.
Let me stop you there.
So we go down to the East River to one of the piers, and there is the British ship, the Queen Mary, which at that time was the largest, most luxurious ship in the world, or had been before the war. And let me clear up one thing, because I said this one time, and a young fella corrected me. He said, I don't think it was bigger than the Titanic. I don't know. And I'm not trying to be smart, but the Titanic was sunk. So I have no idea about how luxurious it was, or how big or how small it was. But the Queen Mary, as of January 1944, was the biggest ship afloat. And we got on the Queen Mary, and it was a very luxurious ship, as I say. And here again, I've given this talk several times, and looking back over my notes, I talk about the stateroom, and one time I've got 16 of us in there, one time I've got 24 of us. I frankly don't remember exactly. I didn't make notes at that time, not knowing, frankly, that I was even coming back to the United States, much less be talking about the war to anybody. But the stateroom was originally for 2 people, probably a man and his wife, and it was very luxurious, as I say. But when we were on board, rather than the 2,500 they would normally have, I'm told there were 25,000 of us soldiers on there going to England. So we didn't have 2 to a stateroom. We had somewhere between either 16 or 24 in a stateroom. But it could 1/4 of that number could sleep in that stateroom, because everything we had, our duffel bags, which had our shelter halves, our tents, our guns, everything we had was right there, and they had to stay in that room. So we spent 2 nights on the deck for every 1 night that we spent inside the room. The worst thing about sleeping on deck, number one, it was wintertime. Number two, the British owned the ship and they operated the ship, and those British sailors every morning at daylight, which was somewhere about 6 o'clock, I guess, they swabbed down the decks, which means they took big garden hose type things, and they did not look to see if somebody was asleep. They just shot that water on you, and so you can imagine how awful it was. Another thing was the dining room could only accommodate so many people. So we were told we'd be fed twice a day. We'd be fed breakfast somewhere in the morning, and we'd be fed dinner sometime in the late afternoon. The first morning I went for breakfast, and there was a huge long line, which we were familiar with. We called them mess lines, and we were going to eat chow. What we had never experienced, or I certainly had never, breakfast that morning was not ham and eggs or sausage and eggs or anything like that. It was a favorite British breakfast called fish stew. And I have no earthly idea how they make it, and I don't want to know. It did not look good, but there was nothing else to eat. So they put the fish stew in my canteen, and I was told to go over and find a place and sit down and eat. And there were these huge long tables, and I went and sat down on the lower part of one of the tables where I could find a seat. And the Queen Mary, being so fast, did not go with an escort of other ships. You have to remember the war's going on, and the Germans dominated the Atlantic Ocean with their U-boats, torpedo boats, submarines. And in order to avoid those, the Queen Mary shifted position about every 7 minutes. And when turning like that, you can imagine it veered from side to side. And as I was sitting there, just as I was getting a spoonful of fish stew out of the canteen, it shifted, and my canteen went shooting down, on down and off the table, and from up above somewhere comes another canteen, and it stops right in front of me, and it is full of fish stew, but it also, the fellow upchucked and left his stomach stuff in the canteen before it left his area. Needless to say, I did not eat breakfast. I'll also say, during the time that it took us to get to England, I did not go back to the dining room. I didn't eat again. I was not hungry. We landed in Scotland. They got us off the ship. We were put on railroad trains. I forget what the British call their railroad trains. Not at all like ours. And here again, it was, of course, a war was going on, really going on in England, so there were no lights, and it was nighttime, and we sat in the dark from Scotland down to Trowbridge, England. Trowbridge, you'll find on your map, is about 5 miles from Bath. It's somewhere about 50, 60, 75 miles from London. It's an old part of England. We were not allowed to leave once we got inside this camp where we were. But I would say this, my brother David was in the Air Force, and David got a leave. He was in the northern part of England, out of London, and he took a leave and come to see me. Of course, I couldn't get out to spend any time with him, but my captain said, let's find him a place to sleep if he wants to. He can sleep right here with us. And he did, and we taught him how to drive a tank. And so he said he had a wonderful time. I thought it was so delightful to have my brother come to see me so far away from home. But you'd have to know Dave to know how special he really was. June the 6th was called D-Day. I was either at the port in south of England getting on a small boat, I guess, that was to take us to France, or perhaps I was already on it. But I do know when daylight came and we looked out, it was awe-inspiring. I'm told there were over 5,000 ships in the English Channel that day, and mine was one of them. And we were all heading for France. I did not land at Omaha Beach. I did not land on D-Day. I landed June the 8th on Utah Beach. The only difference in Utah Beach and Omaha, Omaha had movies made about it, and Utah didn't. You could get killed just as easily on Utah Beach as you could Omaha Beach. There were as many dead people, and all the things you never want to see were there on at Utah Beach. We landed, and we immediately became involved in what is known as hedgerow country, where the farmers, their farms, rather than being fenced in, had briar patches that would grow. They'd have the land built up for about 3-4 feet, and then briar patches on top of that, and it was very thick, and that was called hedgerows. And that's where we did our fighting at first, is in the hedgerows. German in one, we in the other, and you just do the best you can.
Hold on.